together to achieve our greater goals. If you see me as your sister, I go see you as me brother. Cause we are one people, one continent with one vision. Yeah. If we give our love, we go reap our more. We can make here a better place if we live in love. With that we stand, the stronger we can be. We keep winning, yeah. Africa is rising. We are rising, yeah. Ooh, we are rising, yeah. Africa,
Africa, yeah.
Mama Africa,
Africa, yeah.
it's Africa.
Reverend Angelique.
Welcome, everyone. It is absolutely a delight to have you here in this space. Welcome to this season of what we know, at least in parts of the Americas, as Black History Month. We began this journey on the International Day of People of African Descent on August 31st last year. And then we met during the time of the World Food Day, honoring World Food Day, in October for the second part of the series. And today is part 3, recognizing again the importance of the history of Pan-African peoples, because we know that Black history is global and it is domestic wherever we are in the world. We are delighted to bring to fore a time for thinking through strategizing. This is a strategy session whereby we take the recommendations offered to us in the first 2 sessions. We were honored from some very distinguished panelists who came and spoke to us to give us some direction, major thought leaders in the Pan-African global space and in the domestic spaces where we reside. We had people like Dr. David Comosong, ambassador from Barbados. We had Dr. Washington, major scholar on health and trauma. Also, we had Dr. Tamara Stevenson working on issues of food security. And we also had people like Dr. Gay McDougall, who is with CERD, one of the mechanisms of the United Nations on racism. And we also had people like Dr. Justin Hansford from Howard University, who serves also on the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. There are others that were with us, but they will come to fore as we further discuss our issues for today. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Michael McElrain. I'll say more about him, but he is the rapporteur for the United Nations Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. We will also have 4 experts who've been working on your committee to bring this moment to us today. And we also are pleased to say that this is a partnership with Africans Rising, and Maurice is in the house and he will see to it that we all kind of stay together, Maurice Samba. And we are also in partnership, of course, with Bread for the World, you already know, and the work we do in the Pan-African space and the Garifuna Nation, but also networks throughout the Pan-African Working Group related therein. Welcome, we're delighted to have you. We're going to proceed in the following order. We're going to have an overview of what some of the recommendations were coming out of our previous 2 sessions as we prepare for the 3rd session of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent in April in Geneva, Switzerland. Much has happened since this started off and since the advocacy some of us were a part of that brought it into fruition. And Dr. McElrain was one of those persons. So he also is an advocate, founder, and also a leader in this moment. We're so honored to have him to help us. So let's move forward with the overview from Mr. Albert Jayan, who is with us from the committee, who's going to provide an overview. You should have gotten that ahead of time in the announcement of the session today. But we also will then proceed with the formal introduction of Dr. McElrain, who will come and give us his presentation. And then those 4 themes, let's be thinking about them now. 1, reparatory justice. That is a major theme that comes out of the discussions at the Permanent Forum. Also, the issue of food insecurity. food insecurity. We're going to talk about that. And then, of course, the issue of economics and trade. And then also health and trauma in an educative manner, which is also going to be a focal point of education at the upcoming forum. So, Mr. Jayan, I should say, Albert, see, I always call him Albert. Albert, it is over to you, and then we'll come back for an introduction formally of our special guest, Dr. McElroy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reverend Angelique. I'm equally glad to have us all here. And interestingly, it looks like we are scattered across the globe as we originally planned. Intentionally or accidentally, we have members in Ghana, Grenada, Malawi, and some of us here in the DC area, close to, well, a stone throw away from the White House. Not so much to say we are going to be throwing stones that way, but every now and then we need to wake up those who are in charge to some extent of our destiny. Let me emphasize from the very beginning, the theme, of course, of this is to strategize for the third session of the United Nations Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. You know, we've had a number of conversations, and often it has sounded like we're talking among ourselves. So the goal here today is to invite you to interact with us, you know, and we are hoping that the various presentations by our lead discussants will get you into interacting. We will make it possible for you to put something in the chat, and Maurice will help you if you want to make a verbal or oral intervention to do so. But let's start by acknowledging where we've come from. I mean, I think some will ask, what does a small group like ours, the Pan-African Working Group, what role can it play in advancing this large agenda of rebuilding the Pan-African agenda? So our main mantra is let 100 flowers bloom. And we know for a fact and embrace the fact that we stand on the shoulders of giants. As our dear pioneer Marcus Mbosa Garvey said, people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. So our pioneering Pan-Africanists were visionary leaders and thinkers who advocated for the unity and the liberation of people of African descent across the world. They challenged the legacy of slavery, colonialism, and racism that oppressed and exploited Black people in various ways. They also celebrated the rich and diverse history and culture of Africa and its diaspora. So let me just begin by paying small homage to one of the critical milestones of this Pan-African movement, which was the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, in England in 1945, where for the first time, you know, Pan-Africanists from Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, and the United States came together to advocate for the political unification of the peoples of African descent. Of course, among them, notably were my first Prime Minister, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, the George Padmore of Trinidad and Tobago, Azikiwe of Nigeria, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, and of course, W.B. Du Bois, that time living in Massachusetts. And of course, he's now resting in Ghana, my homeland. This really points to the fact that almost close to 6 years, we are still nowhere close to meeting the challenge that the pioneers have put before us. But what we in the Pan-African Working Group have come to realize is that, you know, the struggle that we have seen in various forms with Rosa Parks on the bus boycott, the civil rights leaders with Martin Luther King. We just celebrated his day here in this country. And this month is Black History Month in the United States. I call it every year, every month is Black History Month. So we, my folks at the Sandy Spring Slave Museum celebrate it every day, actually. But this is a moment for us to acknowledge our history and make emphasis to meet the challenges that our pioneers provided or laid out before us. Yeah. Just to quickly highlight some of the key elements, besides, of course, the independence movement, where in the 60s, many African countries came together. And then in 63 led to the Africa Union that got established in Ethiopia, with 32 signatories. I mean, that's no small feat. Of course, now today we have the African Union, which was formed in 2002, but one issue that I don't want us to underplay is the fact that we, as the broad masses, people across the globe, where we saw our most important contribution is the anti-apartheid movement, where we joined across from all creed and countries in the corner of the world to help free Mandela and got South Africa to elect its first Black leader. So there is somewhat, for many who think this is just talk and idealism, we've seen signs that we can unite and come together across the globe. But I'll be remiss not to acknowledge that in the most recent history, one important force and movement has been the Black Lives Matter movement, which, for those who are not aware, was a movement that started with the killing of dear brother Trayvon Martin, and luckily our sister Ava DuVernay has sort of memorialized that whole sad experience in her new film Origin. If you've not seen it yet, I will encourage you to see that, which is based on the book Caste. So there's been a lot that has been going on, and many in their own corners are really striving to build this front that we've been been talking about. But for us in the Pan-African Working Group, we are at this moment trying to build the Pan-African agenda using the UN Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. We believe that this forum is a unique and promising opportunity to amplify our voices and advocate for our rights at the international level. So we are inviting you all to be part of this very unique endeavor. For those of us who have worked with UN processes, sometimes we find them too convoluting and sometimes too slow. But what we are seeking to do with our working group is enable you to get some access to the conversation, to be part of that conversation. So we are happy actually to have among us today the rapporteur who is going to help give us some insight as to how best we can help shape the conversation that will be following up with the third session in Geneva in April. So let me quickly just summarize what I think my colleagues will believe our what I would call the mandate, the baton we've taken for our pioneers, Pan-African pioneers. What are we seeking to do? How do we contribute to this political, economic, and social injustice struggle that has been oppressing our people for years? We hope to improve the lives of our people, African descent. And often whenever I am confronted with the question of who are they, and I say, well, the continent of Africa is the cradle of humanity. That's where all humanity comes. So if you can relate to that, you're part of the struggle. But of course, we know those who are suffering the most from the brunt of our discrimination and oppression are people of color across the globe. Okay, we hope to contribute to the elaboration of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights for People of African Descent, which will be a first step towards the legal binding instrument. That is a very key contribution that we see here. We saw what the International Human Rights Declaration has done for, at least in our world, of having civil discourses and making sure we can hold leaders accountable. We hope to do likewise with the UN Declaration on the Rights of People of African Descent. Okay, we're hoping to address the structural issues affecting our community, such as health, education, economic development, environmental injustice, and reparations. My colleagues will go in depth in some of those here. We are striving to foster collaboration and solidarity between Black communities and other marginalized groups to advocate for collective liberation and justice. We hope that with our efforts and with our partners, we can hold governments and institutions accountable for implementing reparative measures, dismantling the system of oppression and discrimination. Last but not least, we often say we are Black and we are proud. We claim our African heritage and identity, and we ask for space and time to heal the trauma that has been caused by many across the globe and still being caused. Okay. Our main goal as this advocacy network working group is to create public awareness and education, and to make this UN process a lot more accessible to as many of our people who can relate to the issue without alienating them with some who call UN jargonese. But I know our rapporteur is more than very ground to earth, and he's more not just a consultant, but he's an activist, so he speaks our language. No fear in that sense, will be alienated. So I'm often said to be quite long-winded, and I know I am sometimes, but when you get passionate about some of these issues, there's no other way than when you're given such an opportunity, you try and see whether you get everything on the table. But the intention is to hear more from you all. So I'm really glad that you've taken time to join us today and to learn, and to be inspired and to inspire us and give us feedback. We'll give you a couple of tools that ADNA is providing through our partnership with Africans Rising with our colleague in Senegal. And at the moment, we are praying for Senegal that all turns out well. Maurice is right there. They have a demonstration in another hour or so to at least contest them and sort of challenge the politics of the current regime. So without further ado, just to mention that I have colleagues, Lydia Curtis in Grenada, Muiza Muktali in Malawi, Priscilla Ankara from Ghana. Egbert is yet to join us, Egbert from the Garifuna Nation, and of course, Mark Harrison and our dear sister, Angelique here in the DC area. So our Reverend Angelique, who some have called her they call her, they use a word that often is used for, is it called a taskmaster, they call you, Angelique? But, she's been able to get us going when we felt there's no further we can go. But she's been able to keep the link between what is happening at the UN, what is happening in both in New York and in Geneva, as well as what is happening in DC, and keep us abreast and informed so that we could timely send some of our contributions to the process that is ongoing. And through her contacts and connections, we've been able to invite some of those who are directly involved in the UN process to be part of our conversation. So Angelique, I think I'll pass this over to you to introduce our August speaker, what we call him, facilitator extraordinaire, Dr. Michael McCarron. Take it on.
Thank you so much, Brother Albert. And as you can see, it's passionate, and we are so glad for the passion that's within this working team. Now, without further ado, we are pleased to bring to you our featured guest to help us with this time of strategic thinking, Dr. Michael McElrain, who I'm very pleased to say is a dear colleague of mine as well, and a few others here on the task force. Dr. McElrain has a PhD in philosophy from Aalto Akademi University in Finland. He currently is a visiting assistant professor of post-colonial studies at the University of Bremen in Germany. Previously, he has held teaching positions in philosophy, African American studies, and human rights studies in the United States and in Sweden. Among his publications are news media as well as academic journal articles and 3 edited collections, Severi Andra, Post-Colonia. I am not Swedish, and therefore you're going to bear with me on that. But basically, it is the issue around post-colonial perspectives, emotions and understandings, perspectives. The Afro-Nordic landscapes, equality and race in Northern Europe, with a foreword by Paul Gilroy, who many of us certainly know, on Routledge Press in 2014. Dr. McGarren is also a seasoned international activist in the areas of anti-racism and reparatory justice. And in this moment, he brings all of that and so much more to the leadership role of being the rapporteur for the UN Forum on People of African Descent. Michael, you're welcome in this space. You honor us, and we're delighted to hear from you now, what you have to offer to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith. Thanks a lot for that very kind introduction, and greetings, everyone. It is a great pleasure and an honor to be on this call with you. Just before we proceed, Angelique, is this recorded or not? Just so that I know.
Yes, it's my understanding that it is being recorded. Maurice, can you confirm that, please? Yes, I see the big thumbs up. Okay, so be aware. Yes.
Okay, be aware, exactly. Yes. All right. So yes. So greetings, everyone, and I plan on doing a brief presentation of the forum, and you know, it's going to be improvised, so I hope I won't forget anything. And you know, if you have any questions, please, of course, do let me know. So to refer back to Mr. Jan's wonderful presentation there on Pan-Africanism and linking it to the work that we're doing and the Permanent Forum, let me begin by saying that indeed this Permanent Forum is a unique opportunity to you know, build Pan-Africanism globally, and especially across the diaspora, but also globally. And so one thing connected to that, when the UN talks about people of African descent, how that is usually defined is basically the African diaspora, or, you know, if you will, Black people outside the continent. So that is so the focus is the diaspora, but as we all know, the diaspora is intimately connected to the continent in many ways. And only here in Europe, just to mention one example, most people of African descent here in Europe are have either a first or second generation background on the continent, from the continent. Just to mention one close connection. So when we talk about people of African descent, in the diaspora, the distinction between people of African descent in the diaspora and Africans on the continent is oftentimes a superficial one. And we, the members of the Permanent Forum, have made sure that Pan-Africanism is a part of the agenda, and it was one of the themes at the second session of the Permanent Forum, which was held last year in May and June in New York. So the Permanent Forum is actually is a result of the processes coming out of the Third World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, 2001, and its outcome document, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. And among the recommendations in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action was the establishment of a UN working group of experts on people of African descent, which was established the year after 2002, and as you all know, is still in operation. And out of you know, these sorts of Durban processes, this led to the establishment first of the International Year for People of African Descent, which was 2011, and then the International Decade for People of African Descent, which is concluding this year and running from 2015 until this year, 2024. And a part of the program of activities of the International Decade for People of African Descent was the establishment of a forum for people of African descent. I think the program of activities says that this forum should take place for 3 days. I believe it is, and it is called a forum and not a permanent forum. But now we have a permanent forum that holds annual sessions for 4 days, and every other year in Geneva and every other year in New York. This permanent forum was established by the General Assembly in August 2021. And besides its annual sessions in Geneva or New York, with the possibility of a third location, as so decided by the General Assembly, and I believe I've been told that Brazil would like to host a session of the forum. So who knows, maybe the fourth session of the permanent forum or the fifth will be held in Brazil. And the permanent forum consists of a committee, one can say, of 10 members that are geographically, representative. And as you all know, the UN has 5 official regions, and these regions are represented among the 10 members. 5 of the members were nominated by member states and elected by the General Assembly, and 5 members were nominated by either civil society or member states and elected by the Human Rights Council and the President of the Human Rights Council. And the permanent forum has a bureau of a chair and a vice chair and a rapporteur. The chair and the vice chair are supposed to be elected for each year. The rapporteur can be elected, the same person can be elected for the entire mandate, but can also, of course, be circulated. And we now have our first chair and vice chair was Epsie Campbell Barr was our first chair, as you all may be very familiar with her, and she is a former vice president of Costa Rica, the first African descendant woman to be a vice president in Latin America. She was also the minister of Foreign Affairs. She was our first chair. Our vice chair was Alison Com, who is a famous Cameroonian human rights lawyer with a focus on LGBTQI human rights in Cameroon, a pioneer in that area. Now, from the new year, we have elected a new chair and a vice chair. The new chair is Ambassador June Sumo from St. Lucia, and our vice chair is Ambassador Mona Omar from Egypt, and I am the rapporteur. So yes, just to give you a brief summary of the first 2 sessions of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, the first session was held in Geneva from the 5th to the 8th of December 2022, and among its themes were systemic racism, the inclusion of people of African descent in the Sustainable Development Agenda, the case for climate justice, the inclusion of people of African descent in the Sustainable Development Agenda, the case for reparatory justice, connecting the past and the future, United Nations Declaration on the Promotion, Protection, and Full Respect of the Human Rights of People of African Descent, and finally, connecting the past and the future, equality for all people of African descent. And then, yes, then also the future work of the Permanent Forum. So that was the themes of the first session, and the themes of the second session were global reparatory justice, Pan-Africanism, transnational migration, systemic and structural racism, and health, well-being, and intergenerational trauma. Both of these, the first and the second session, had about 1,000 civil society participants from across the world that got to, that attended these sessions. And we are expecting that this third session will have even more people of African descent from across the world. Now, in this third session, the themes that we have decided on is the first one will be on reparations, sustainable development, and economic justice. The second theme is going to be on education, overcoming systemic racism and historic harm. The third theme is going to be on culture and recognition. And the fourth theme is going to be on the second International Decade for People of African Descent. The General Assembly has already suggested that there's going to be a second International Decade for People of African Descent. This second decade, however, has not been established yet, and there's not a program of activities for it. So we will be discussing these matters at the third session. Now, these sessions and the work of the Permanent Forum is a unique opportunity for civil society across the world to address the United Nations directly, right? And so there's no other forum or consultative mechanism, platform like this, where civil society can address the UN directly and offer recommendations to the UN through the Permanent Forum. And and recommendations are central, right? And this is what makes the Permanent Forum different from other mechanisms, such as the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, which travels around the world. When invited by a country, it visits this country, and then it writes up a report on the human rights situation of people of African descent in this country, and offers then recommendations to the government of this country on people of African descent in that country. So it is, if you will, a monitoring mechanism. Now, the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent is not a monitoring mechanism like this. It is not a part of our mandate to travel the world and issue report on the human rights situation of people of African descent. Our mandate is more focused, if you will, on solutions and on concrete policy recommendations and advice to any part of the UN system, including the General Assembly and Human Rights Council and the member states of the United Nations. So this is also something to keep in mind from a civil society perspective, that the focus of this work is really on recommendations and advice, policy recommendations and advice. So when you come to the sessions and you give statements, this should also be the focus of your interventions. Of course, there's room for various kinds of statements and so forth, raising issues of various kinds and so forth. But just then keep in mind what the mandate of this Permanent Forum is, and what the Permanent Forum is meant to do and not do, and can act on and not act on, and how. Now, for all of us, including myself, the UN system can be, quite daunting. It's very large. It's a very sprawling system with a lot of different mechanisms and parts of it, and a lot of various kinds of instruments, human rights instruments, and so forth. So there's, a lot to consider, a lot to learn about, a lot to keep in mind when engaging with the Permanent Forum. And I think for all of us, civil society included, is going to be a learning curve and a process that has to build over time and be strengthened over time, how we engage with the Permanent Forum, and so that we are able to engage as effectively as possible and use this space as effectively as possible so that it can have as large social impact on the actual situations of people of African descent and Africans across the world. Yeah, so now, and then, besides giving statements, when you give statements at the Permanent Forum, not everyone that signs up on the speakers list and want to speak might have an opportunity to actually speak, because there are usually more speakers than there is time. Now, for this third session, we have narrowed down our panel discussions from 5 to 4 to give civil society an additional half a day to be able to speak, right? So there will be more speaking time this time. However, there might not be an opportunity still for everyone that wants to speak. But even if you don't speak, you can always, and you should in any case, send in your statement in a written format, submit your statement to the Secretariat, and then that will be brought to the attention of the 10 members of the Permanent Forum, including myself, right? So even if you don't get to speak, you can still get a proper hearing. And besides speaking inside the plenary at the sessions, there's also an opportunity for you to, any civil society, to organize side events. And the side events can either be in person at the Permanent Forum, or they can be held online. And you can also participate online and give statements online, although the space for online statements is smaller than the space for giving statements in person. So that is also something to keep in mind. What is also, I think, good to keep in mind for these sessions is that besides engaging, seeing these sessions as a platform, as a consultative mechanism for people of African descent and other relevant stakeholders to directly engage the UN, it is also an opportunity for you to congregate with other civil society from across the world and see this also as an annual Pan-African conference at the UN level, where you get to meet other people of African descent from across the world, exchange with them, and begin various kinds of collaboration, maybe build global campaigns and this sort of thing. So the space, should be used, I'm hoping, very creatively in this way also. So I really meant to also say a few words here about the current and future developments of the Permanent Forum and the role of civil society in these developments. I know I was also supposed to comment on the recommendations from the Pan-African Working Group, but my time is up. So hopefully we will get a chance to return to the recommendations, and also when there's time for Q&A, there'll be more opportunities for me to add things that I may have missed now. So thanks a lot.
Well, as you can see, as we said, he is certainly the man for the task, and we certainly are grateful, again, Dr. McGarry, for you taking the time to be with us of all the other things you could be doing, and we're just grateful. It is now time to engage all of you, and I am so pleased that we have a working team of experts who are going to help facilitate that conversation with you. We are going to begin with the various themes that have been identified, and that includes Miss Lydia Curtis, who is going to lead us in our reflection time around the issues of health and trauma from an educative perspective. We had Dr. Washington with us, who gave us some direction about this, he being a colleague of hers as well, to help us understand how do we deal with health, trauma, bringing an educative lens of how it is our people of African descent, engage generational trauma. That feeds into the whole issue around systemic racism. So we're going to turn to Sister Lydia. I will say she is a sister of this great work. She is a leader of the parish council at her Catholic Church of St. Augustine Catholic Church, founded in 1858. They've been around a long time. So she knows something about Black history, and certainly from the Catholic perspective as well. But she's also a community leader. Sister Lydia, won't you lead us in the time we have to use the chat and a few verbal responses to the questions and thoughts you may share. Thank you so much.
Certainly, Angelique, thank you. It's an honor, and I'm very excited to make my few brief remarks and listen to what people have to say. So during our Black August presentation, Dr. Kevin Mwata Washington spoke to recommendations number 34 through 37 of the preliminary conclusions from the second session. These recommendations ask member states to consider policies to, 1, create universal health insurance that includes mental health treatment. 2, consider policies and create culturally safe systems in public and private institutions. 3, address health disparities and intergenerational trauma caused by the legacy of systemic racism. And 4, the creation of a World Health Organization task force on intergenerational trauma with the additional themes of race and ethnicity. Dr. Washington shared with us in his area of expertise, which is intergenerational trauma. He talks about how trauma can be transmitted through the DNA, the science of which is called epigenetics. He posits that emotional and psychological healing must take place in order for Black people to be whole. He and practitioners like Rachel Bayard Cooks in the San Francisco area are in the forefront. The European psychotherapy model is inappropriate for treating Black people, and the World Health Organization must reject it. Washington and others, like the Community Healing Network, have created Ubuntu psychotherapeutic model, which replaces European nomenclature with Zulu concepts. It is holistic, and it links Black people with their past. It uses the healing modality called Umzembezi, which is a Zulu term. And this concept helps trauma victims reconnect with their true identity through various rituals. Dr. Washington talks about the impact of 400 years of trauma, but we already know the impacts. So now let's discuss and explore some other areas through the following questions. This is where I stop talking. I'm going to ask 4 questions, and I'm going to pair them 2 at a time and invite you to respond by either raising your hand or by writing in the chat. The first pair of questions are, what core belief systems do we need to look at and change in order for true healing to take place among Black communities? And who should facilitate the healing? And how do we prepare those healings and healing institutions? how do we build them and support them? So let's look at those first two questions together, reflect on them for 30 seconds. And if you have some answers, you can start writing in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and our text will help you to speak. And then after we do that for a few minutes, I will posit the next two questions. Let's see what we have. I'm looking at my screen. Looking at the participants, we have 24 participants. I'm going to read the questions again. We have time. We have 8 minutes left. I just used 2.5. We have 8 minutes left. What core belief systems do we need to look at and change in order for true healing to take place? Now, remember, Dr. Washington said that the whole European model needs to be thrown out. So when I'm thinking about core belief systems that need to be changed, I'm thinking about the whole education system, the whole system of the white, the whole idea of, using the white models in the schools, the psychotherapy model coming out of Germany, those pioneers in the white tradition. Okay, we have two people who are. So I was thinking we could start there. Okay, right. Okay, so Ekmemini says we need to leave and get away from our racial inferiority complexes. Okay. And then Priscilla said, we think about language. Yeah, so Dr. Washington, his whole language, he's bringing in different languages. He's bringing in Bantu and Zulu languages, and using concepts from those communities to create healing modalities. He's not using, he and others, because it's not just him, they're not using the old modalities that came out of Europe. They're starting new things. They're starting circles. I know that there was a group that started maybe 8 years ago. Their first session was at the Congressional Black Caucus in Washington, D.C. They met there all day and you could participate. And then that same group stayed together the whole year. They met once a month doing different healing things. I did not participate, so I can't be specific. And then they came back the next year and they built upon that. So those are the kinds of things totally outside of what anyone had ever seen before, And so let me see, there are other people. I want to stop talking so other people can talk. So that's everything that was in the chat. Does anybody would like to raise their hand? I know that my sister Amira, she's brilliant. She may have something to say. We can open up her mic if she would like to say something. Land distribution. So Egbert, we need to think about land distribution, and Egbert, if you wanted to expand on that. I know there are different groups who had in the United States have talked about getting land. And then there are other people who talk about repatriation, moving to other land. And what other ideas do you have, Egbert, about land? It's certainly easier to heal if you have your own space.
Let me verbalize it. I'm looking at what's going on in my nation, Garifuna Nation.
Yes.
In Honduras, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, and even St. Vincent, where the government doesn't seem to want to respect our indigenous autonomy to these lands, and their threats, not only physically, but also the government is using the big stick to take away our lands and give it to these big corporations. But we do know that there is a history of how we traditionally use these lands, handing it from generation to generation without really selling them. So that's what I'm thinking, going back to those traditional ways of how we use land and care for the land rather than just be selling it and looking at it as a monetized commodity.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes. And Emira would like to speak. If someone could open up her mic.
Thank you so much for this phenomenal session, for the opportunity to learn and get updated further on the Permanent Forum, and for the space to be able to think collectively, strategize collectively, and create our own input into the process. So thank you to the African, the ADNA, the Advocacy Network for Africa, as well as Africans Rising, for creating this space, and to everybody for making time today. I think, Sister Lydia, you just so beautifully framed this, and the intergenerational trauma and the ways of bringing forth healing that will carry forward for future generations. I think some of the issues around understanding our relationship to the earth, to nature, and to the ancestors, and understanding the knowledge base, as well as the spiritual strength that we get as a basis of our healing from the power of the ancestors. So I guess I just wanted to to kind of raise that in the moment when someone was saying so beautifully, you know, folks are thinking about artificial intelligence being the way forward, and we know that it's ancestral intelligence, ancestral knowledge that will heal us and will help us to understand what's within and what's around in nature that will bring us to a better reality. So I think I just wanted to lift up the importance of thinking about environmental justice in that context as we think about healing and think about spaces that help us heal, reclaiming our land, reclaiming our connection to nature. That's all a part of it, wherever we may be, whether we're in the midst of things in Senegal heating up and feeling like it's falling apart in many ways.
Thank you, Emira, for that.
Palestine. But just wanted to thank you for the space for this work.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. And I want to pose the other two questions in the minute and a half that we have left, and then I'll get to Jasmine Campbell. The second pair of questions is this a civil society issue? In what ways can governmental bodies reinforce the work of civil society in the issue of mental health and healing the Black communities? And once the declarations are made and the reports are published, what mechanisms should we have to move the collective healing forward? Once the declarations are made and the reports are published, what mechanisms should we have to move the collective healing forward? Please, comments on that. While you're thinking about that, I'm going to read Jasmine's comment in the chat. Our approach, which says, our approach to medicine and healing and healthcare, the belief that allopathic care is the holy grail. This is what needs to be changed. Instead, we need to explore more diverse approaches and preventive actions. Well, certainly that was reflected in Dr. Washington's presentation in August, and we see some of it in the recommendations. And so in the 20 seconds that we have left, does anyone want to put some comments in the chat about the second pair of questions? And then as we move on to our next presenter, we can come back to, we can pull out some of the highlights from the chat. Please put your comments in the chat as we move forward. I stayed within my time. Albert took my extra 3 minutes. So we will work on that next time. Okay, but anyway, thank you. I enjoyed this. This was an exciting process, and I'm looking forward to more comments in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Lydia, for that wonderful engagement. We are going to proceed in the same fashion with Ms. Priscilla Ankra. Ms. Priscilla Ankra is a Ghanaian and U.S. leader in human rights advocacy, law, and media. Sister Priscilla, it's my understanding you're in Ghana at the moment. We welcome you into the space around the themes of economics and trade. And here we were brought to discussion with Dr. Kamasong, the ambassador from Barbados. Welcome, Sister Priscilla.
Thank you. And I'm so, I can't think of a better way to spend my Friday here. And so I'm just going to summarize a few themes that the brilliant attorney Kamasong touched on in regards to economics and trade. And so I'll start off by saying that much of our reality as Black people is marked by plunder. The plunder of our bodies, the plunder of those who came before us, and the continuing plunder of our labor, our land, and our ideas. In 2023, the plunder continues and reifies itself through the deliberate underdevelopment of our countries and predatory financial systems like the IMF, guaranteeing that future generations remain trapped in the cycle of debt. Moreover, when we actively participate within the global economy, it is marked by unfettered discrimination. For example, as Attorney Kamasong touched on, systems like the Corruption Perception Index, which ranks countries by their perceived levels of public sector corruption, as determined by expert assessments and opinion surveys, places nearly all African and Caribbean nations between a score of 30 through 49, rendering access to loans, international business cooperation, and partnerships unduly burdensome. And these same types of discriminatory regulations are replicated in the EU. I believe Attorney Kamasong talked about how these types of regulations even made opening a simple bank account in Barbados, where he's from, nearly impossible. And at the domestic and regional levels, we as Black people are overrepresented in indicators of poverty and are marginalized when it comes to access to education, employment, healthcare, housing, markets, loans, you name it. And so with all this said, I know it's a lot of darkness, but there are pockets of light and resistance. And within this, Attorney Kamasong talked about how regional partnerships such as the Bridgetown Initiative that emphasizes partnerships between Africa and the Caribbean are slowly blossoming. And I'm happy to say that as a Ghanaian, we are one of the key partners in this initiative. Another fight that was won in this continuing resistance was the addition of the African Union to the G20 summit. And so now it's the G21 summit. And it's, just thinking about the audacity of these institutions to exclude, billions of people from this impact summit. So that's a major win. And I will conclude by reiterating some of the recommendations from the Permanent Forum itself. And so one of the key recommendations from the Permanent Forum was including the drafting of guidelines for data collection that focuses on race and racial inequalities in the global economy, and to establish new international economic and financial orders that recognize the equity and the right of African people to, and people of African descent to develop their own nations. And lastly, another key recommendation was the collection of data on racial disparities within the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so with that, I will put forth a couple of questions. I don't know how well I'm doing on time, and hopefully we can facilitate a fruitful discussion and strategy. So part of the recommendations from the second session from the Permanent Forum included making the diaspora the 21st region of the African Union, the African diaspora, the Black diaspora. So how do we foresee this empowering African people globally to harness our economic power? And so that's my first question. And my second question is that in 2022, remittances to Africa alone amounted to $53 billion. So what does this say about our economic force within the global Black diaspora? And how may we, for example, create financial institutions that benefit our communities through these remittances? And so I see this as part of a ferment of the types of movements on the ground that Attorney Komasong talked about, where we can, realize our own destiny through self-organizing. So I will put these questions in the chat, and I hope that we can have a fruitful discussion.
Ms. Priscilla, as you know, you've done a wonderful job. And we were so honored to have Ambassador Komasong with us to discuss these matters. Please, everyone, please respond in the chat. We will come back. We're planning to come back to these matters as we move toward the end of our time, which is coming more quickly than we'd like. We'd like to now move to the issue of food security. And to help us with this particular theme is Mr. Mwiza Mthali, who is an activist and specialist in Africa and African diaspora affairs. He is the host of the radio program Africa Now, yes, and we all know it well, that deals with these issues. But he is also one who has his own legacy as having been the outreach director of Trans-Africa Forum, a policy advocacy organization for many years. Some of you remember Trans-Africa was a key game changer relative to the Free South Africa movement. He was integral to that period of time. Also continuing to maintain links, communications with multilateral agencies, U.S. government offices, African and Caribbean embassies and governments and organizations. He himself is also a legend of our times. Mr. Mwiza, please help us with some of the reflections on food insecurity that you would share at this time. Thank you for joining us, sir.
I'm very flattered by that. I'm not sure if I'm a legend in my time, but I hope
true.
I can live
we know
up to
it's
that.
true, Mwiza. You're modest.
I'm actually, as I was listening to the other everybody else, this follows up to some of the questions that were raised earlier. But let me just start by saying that in October, the Advocacy Network for Africa, as a Pan-African Working Group, had the discussion, which was the second part of our discussion, focusing on the UN Permanent Forum draft session, the draft that was put together in June of what was the deliberations that were coming out of that discussion. So this October, we focused on food, looking at the World Food Day, which was in October. And during that session, we had Ann Miner, who is the National Coordinator of the Biodiversity and Biosafety Association of Kenya. And I think she's on with us today as well. And of course, early on, you mentioned that we had Ambassador David Komasong of Barbados as well. And also with us was Tamra Ray Stevenson, the founder and CEO of WANDA, which is the Women Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture. And I just wanted to point some of the things that were recommended as some of the issues that were raised about food security. Maybe we should say food insecurity, food security, because the issue is not so much food security, but is the insecurity of food and some of the challenges that countries are facing There were issues raised about how African farmers are facing challenges from multinational corporations advancing some of these what is called the Green Revolution, prescripts for farming, which is actually endangering the traditional farming system, and also the traditional crops. We're having the dependency on multinational seeds. There's even no moves to patent certain seeds as well, which is causing the food insecurity. And the other issues raised in that discussion were the push for GMOs in Kenya, for instance, and then of this Tambra Stevenson raised the issue of looking at food insecurity as the intersectional lens on the issue of race and class in connection. Particularly, you look at the situation in like in North America, in the United States, particularly where you have certain neighborhoods are classified as food deserts, where you have the lack of nutritious foods in those areas. And one of the things that that was recommended, some of the things that were recommended by Ms. Tambra Ray Stevens, was that engaging key stakeholders from food industry, civil society, and media, and multinational organizations and economic development institutions to collaborate on building resilient food systems. And also, one of the other recommendations was investing in infrastructure that supports sustainable farming practices, efficient supply chains, and equitable food distribution. But also, one of the other recommendations from Ann Miner was the encouraging the inclusion of African foods. There's now a campaign called #MyFoodIsAfrican, which focuses on food, which has been always there, traditionally there, but has been relegated to the background, particularly with colonization and also neocolonization afterwards, as we talked about how multinational corporations have heavily vested in and taken over food supply and also the cash crop system. So one of the things that has encouraged the development of My Food is African has been an interesting development from the COVID-19 situation. During COVID-19, because of getting supplies from different places, there was a focus on looking inward and looking at the foods which have always been there, and that's helped actually have farmers go back to the foods which they had been growing traditionally, which were resilient in the environment of the continent. Because partly when during the, as you know, during the COVID-19 crisis, there was the supply chain issue of, for instance, wheat couldn't be imported easily because of all the supply chains, everything was shut down. But that forced the people to look inward, to look at what has been always been on the ground. And so there's been this campaign called My Food is African. And I wanted, since I think we're running close to running out of time, I don't want to take up all my time. So I'm going to start by asking the question, actually continue the discussion which was raised earlier, which was actually critical for food production and also for the economic development, which is the issue of land, reclaiming our land. Earlier, there was a question about reclaiming our land. How would this impact on food security or food insecurity, and what ideas do people have on the reclaiming the land? Now, the reclaiming the land can take many forms. You have reclaiming land of the ownership of land, but there's the other aspect of reclaiming land for all those gardeners. Reclaiming the land, I won't give it away, but if what does that mean, and how do we define it? And I hope that's the first question, and then we could take all day talking about that. But that's one of the first questions. How do we claim the land, both in terms of the financial ownership, economic aspect, but the other environmental aspect. So you can say you can write your questions in the chat or raise your hand if it's possible. Let me make sure I can see all the chat. Then if there's any. Thank you for writing the question. How do we reclaim the land? One answer is develop cooperatives. Mark Harrison. If you can expand on that, Mark, what do you mean by in what aspect of cooperatives?
Oh, I was trying to get at the whole issue of ownership. All right. And at least in the concept of this country, and I've seen around the world, is we want corporations to come in, and therefore they would provide, quote, all the jobs and economic security, which is we can see in many places it does not. So therefore, one way to address these concerns is start developing more cooperatives that can help people in rural communities and urban communities to set up jobs and other ways of development.
Yeah, and also I think that also gives power back to the people as well, on the local level. Going back to the tradition of where we've been farming, instead of the cash crop. And there's from Mercury that says that economic empowerment through value addition. That's another way. Growing our own food is the other aspect. And one of the things which Ann Miner talked about was bringing back to the traditional foods. I don't know if Ann Miner is online. Hopefully she is. Hopefully she can also join in the discussion because she was part of this. And I don't know if Tambra Ray Stevenson's on as well. Hopefully they can add some things as well. Are there any other comments on the aspect of this? Then there is also from Egbert says develop farming centers. Yeah, when you say farming centers, what do you mean, Egbert?
I was talking to some brothers in Nigeria who are planting cassava, and I know Garifuna people in Honduras and Belize, we do a lot of cassava planting. And I wanted to engineer that we return some of the old cassava seeds. And he was telling me that as I think about increasing production, that since the farmers are, a little scattered in the community, that we should have like a center. I'm looking at what the Mayans are doing. They have a concept that they're calling forest gardening. And they got like 1,500 acres of land that they will use as a forest garden. But this is tied up with a university here at UC Santa Barbara. And so they're bringing expertise to develop this forest gardening. And I'm thinking that might be one way where we could establish a center using that farm, that garden. And it's early in the morning here. That forest garden. Because what I'm thinking is that the garden itself has the medicine, the agricultural products, and all is now.
And that's going. Sorry, we have to wrap up, unfortunately. And when you say the forest gardening, you're meaning that so it's not just a monoculture; it's that you have many different varieties of plants.
Yes, in a concentrated area, right?
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I have to wrap up, and we could go all day on this. So thank you for it. We'll try to keep talking as after the program.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much for all of that, and we, as usual, leading us in the way of more substantive reflection based on the wonderful presentations that we have shared. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Michael, we're going to ask you after this next theme that will be engaged briefly for you to give us a summation of what you've heard and where you see the way forward to make the recommendations so that we can all leave on time. It is now my joy to bring on Mr. Mark Harrison. Mr. Mark Harrison is the former Peace with Justice Director of the United Methodist Church, which is a global church family. the Reverend Susan Henry Crow, the General Secretary of the Board of Church and Society, said Harrison is a, quote, trusted and authentic colleague, end of quote. Both with the
Don't
staff
believe what
and
you
with
hear.
many people who work on Capitol Hill. But we know Mark's work in the General Board and in the global space was one that promoted principles of the United Methodist Church of voting rights, civil and human rights, justice, healthcare, and also COVID-19 relief. But I'd like to end with this quote that she also says, his capacity to build friendships and lasting relationships has served the church's mission in extraordinary ways. And I would simply say she's right, but not only in the Methodist Church, throughout the world in the Pan-African space. Mr. Harrison, help us with the theme of reparatory justice. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Again, I just want to say I want to center the discussion quickly on reparations, because that was what we talked about mainly when we met. I want to, first of all, before I say anything, I want to say something to Albert. As you made the presentation on Pan-Africanism, I remember the six pack, what we call here in Washington, D.C., where people were organizing for the Sixth Pan-African Congress that took place in Tanzania. And I understand there have been some since then. I had put some questions in the chat. It's called, so as you hear the presentation, you already know what some of the questions are. First of all, Dr. Nkechi Natafa, attorney, activist, educator, and author, and a personal friend, put us in a presentation to us when we met around reparative justice and reparations based on the document that came out of the first and second sessions of the Permanent Forum. What was stressed was the global recognition and action you need to take to make our movement a global movement for supporting reparations for slavery and colonialism, and building on what we're already doing. And we talked about it. She centered around a comprehensive approach to reparations, not just financial compensation, to address the ongoing harms like health, education, and environmental justice. But we need to be holding institutions accountable, nations, institutions, and individuals who benefited from slavery and colonialism should be held accountable, and we need to work to make sure that they are doing the necessary things in the area of reparations for what they have accomplished. I mean, what has been built off our backs as an African people. And we need to discuss, build and establish a UN Global Summit on reparations. Now, I do know that there are efforts going on. I mean, Dr. Michael sent me the information about Africa and CARICOM having met to discuss reparations. I know here in the United States, we have local governments, we have institutions. Just recently, the University of St. Louis talked about reparations because the university had slaves and got benefited from the establishment of that institution. And also, unfortunately, even though we as African Americans gave President Biden 90% of our votes, we still don't have a commission on reparations to come up with recommendations on what the U.S. government should be doing. I want to end there, and I want to give you the opportunity to look at what's already happening, particularly where you live. What do we need to add? Did we miss anything? How can we do a better job of promoting what we're doing? And how can we get governments and institutions to take more action? Thank you.
Mark, thank you so much. And please, the chat is our voice for this discussion. We are keeping a careful record of what is going in the chat because time is not on our side. But now we'd like to hear any reflections that Dr. McElrain would like to offer, and also to offer perhaps a way forward as we think about how these inputs might be entered into the longer vision of the declaration and other outcomes of the, hopefully, another decade of people of African descent, but what his thoughts may be. But just know we will be taking all of the inputs quite seriously as we think about the next forum, but more than that, the work that we're doing in any regard alongside of the great work. So Dr. McIlrain, please help us. We are down, unfortunately, to just a few moments, but you're a scholar, so I know how you know how to do it long wise as well as short wise. Okay, so we're banking on that. All right. Okay, we need the executive summary abstract of what you would want to say.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Walker Smith. So, and thanks to everyone. So, yes, just a few brief comments here. There have been a lot of very important topics and recommendations that have been raised here, including the need to use education for healing, for addressing intergenerational trauma and racial inferiority complexes, and more generally to also put in place mechanisms that would allow for such healing to take place. So to begin with that first, this is tremendously important. Intergenerational and transgenerational trauma was something that we did speak on and address at the second session last year in New York, and there were some recommendations that came out on that subject in our first final report. If you haven't read it yet, please do read our first final report, which you can find on the website of the Permanent Forum in several languages. And, you can skip the first part and scroll down to the bold text with the conclusions and the recommendations. Now, for this third session, one of the topics is going to be education. So that will give us an opportunity, and the theme is education, overcoming systemic racism and historic harm. So this is a great opportunity to raise these sorts of topics. Now, our challenge, I think the challenge for all of us, including myself and my colleagues on the committee, so to speak, is going to be how do we translate these issues into recommendations for the UN, right? So what sort of recommendations can we make? I mean, we could make a general recommendation that we want the UN to address these issues, but the question then remains how, right? And exactly what is it we want to ask the UN to do? So for instance, do we want UNESCO to develop guidelines for what needs to be included in all national curriculums and guidelines for how to teach the history of people of African descent across the world? That just as one example, would we want UNESCO again to set up some sort of online resource for addressing intergenerational trauma for children of African descent in educational spaces? And what sort of resources then are we talking about? So, but we have to use our imagination. We have to be imaginative. We have to think about what is possible, what the UN can act on, what the Permanent Forum can act on, and so on, and speak with each other, and speak also with those that have some institutional insight into what is possible within the framework of the UN. Then there were a lot of other, very important subjects that were raised here. I think all of them, are subjects that the Permanent Forum should be raised at the permanent forum, and the permanent forum should also offer recommendations on that, including, you know, issues of land distribution, and also the sort of economic justice issues that Priscilla mentioned, right? But again, then what sort of recommendations do we want to make to the UN? Now, something that has been referred to many times here is the declaration that is being drafted on the human rights of people of African descent. And this is something I'm hoping also that you, civil society, all of us, will raise our voices on this topic of the declaration, because I can tell you that the declaration that is now being drafted by the Intergovernmental Working Group, and which is not a public draft yet, is not official, so it cannot be shared with anyone officially, but the current drafts, and there have been, I think, 2 drafts now, they are frankly very weak, and they do not include basically any new human rights provisions, and they merely repeat already existing human rights provisions in other already existing human rights instruments. And what I think all of us need to call for is that we want a new declaration with new provisions that can move the needle forward on human rights, protection, respect, and especially fulfillment for people of African descent across the world. We want something new. We want something new. So this is something I think you can push for also, and raise your voice on that. There were several other topics that were raised, but I see I'm out of time here, so let me end here. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much. That is the guidance we need to move forward so we can cohere what we have heard today. I am pleased to say, everyone, that all of our experts today have done just a fabulous job of offering the content, the substance, the reflections, but most importantly as well, the way forward. And you are the way forward. And that's what today was all about. So if you have not put your comments in the chat, this is the time to do it. We're at the end of time. However, we'll be back. And we hope you'll be back with us. Your team will go back and cohere what we've heard. And then we will come back to you again. And we're planning to do that before the forum meets in April. So please look out for your calendars, look for the invite, and your team will get to work and hopefully serve you well. We thank you for joining us for this Black History Month special, the third of a 3-part series. But guess what? Part 4 is on the way because of you. God bless you, and we look forward to the next time. Thank you, everyone, for bringing your voices.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Good one.
God bless, and thanks so much. And by the way, we're only 2 or 3 minutes behind, although we started.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Keep the webinar open for 2 more minutes so people can type.
Yes,
Yeah,
we'll give you
we
2
can-
more
yeah.
minutes to add any more comments, but if you would like to leave, we have officially closed our time. Thank you so much. And this will be available as a recording, so you can still offer comments online otherwise.
Yeah, Albert, where should I send the comments to? What email address?
The Ubuntu.
Ubuntu. Okay, so I keep
Admin
forgetting this.
Ubuntu. Our intern will be tracking all that information.
Can you
Or you
please
could
put
just-
that in the chat, Albert, so that people can use that email to make further responses? That would be great.
Well, I think actually more effectively, Maurice is going to use all those who registered.
Oh, okay, he'll send it out to
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah,
That's
that-
absolutely perfect. Yep,
Yeah,
that's absolutely good.
and we're asking people to have their recommendations, not necessarily they have been recommendations by the UN and other people, but this is the chance for people to give us
Their
new
own
their own ideas. Yes.
That's exactly right. This
Right.
is
So,
an open
Dr.
forum.
Dr. McElrain, so I'm really taking to heart what you said about making those recommendations about how what's currently being drafted is kind of weak, because in the preliminary recommendations that came out of the second session, in number 37, says something specifically about changing some of the topics and themes about adding more about race and ethnicity and trauma to so they've already made that recommendation. So what are you saying? What do we have to do? Do we have to rephrase it? Do we have to repeat it? What do we have to do to make them hear? Because we put it in, we put it in the preliminary and it's still not adding it. What do you suggest we do?
Yeah. So I would say what I would recommend that you do is that you just say, just as a general point, you don't want repetition of what already exists. You want something new, and you want a completely new declaration, a new instrument with new provisions, including provisions on these subjects that you just mentioned.
Okay.
And that we need to be innovative, you know, in this new declaration. And this new declaration, as has already been declared by the General Assembly, is supposed to be a first step towards a new binding agreement, that is to say, a new convention. And there hasn't been a convention on race and racial discrimination. The only convention we have, international one, is the ICERD from 1965, is more than half a century old. It's time for something new. And so this declaration can be a first step towards something new, something stronger, and so forth.
Yes, sir.
Doc, what could help us? I mean, I know this is still not open for discussion, and some of our colleagues, other groups, are working on the declaration. And what I think we could do is, if you could point us in the direction of who is doing what, because there's a need.
Albert, we have stopped recording, right, Maurice? Let us stop recording.
Oh,
Thank you.
well,
It's already, oh, I thought we stopped.
No, it's still recording.
I stopped, but
To stop
we stopped
recording.
recording. We stopped recording, and it started. Okay.
Maurice, can we stop?
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Albert.
We're cool. Yeah, and it comes more to the strategy, and it's along the lines of, we know for a fact that when these conversations take place behind closed doors, you know, folks don't feel pushed to get innovative and adopt some of what you are referring to, the new thinking that is most often seen as somewhat uncomfortable for certain groups. But I think if we can take some of the, well, without naming any names, get the salient issues that are undermining the need to move forward and put it in conversations with some of the groups that we are already having conversations with, and protest. You use the word, let's be creative. And our best creative action is to mobilize, protest. We can even use specific languages. Sometimes we get lost when we get too much into details. But if we can get the key element, which is missing, you know, 50 years plus, we know for a fact what is ailing the people of African descent is this unjust structure. So if you are coming up with a new framework, if it doesn't help in addressing that, then we are failing, you know. So I think our goal at this stage, you know, we're a small group, but we know folks are working behind the scenes, and we need to build alliances. So we'll be very happy, because I know you're talking to folks here and there, point us in some directions. We can have behind the scenes conversations as well. And some of us will be in Geneva, and probably we may want to organize a little bit of a protest if we sense that some of these things are not happening.
Everyone,
somebody raised their hand.
I'm sorry, I need to interrupt because we're way over time, and we're having another session, and we need to follow up. We have ways to contact each other. There's Mr. or Ms. Anderson for a last comment, and then we really need to come to a close. The committee will meet on Monday, everyone knows, so let's follow up at that point as well. Is that Mr. or Ms. Anderson? Please go ahead. Yule Anderson, are you there? Okay. Well,
maybe she can put it in the chat.
Contract in the chat.
Okay, okay, it's in the chat. Thanks, everyone. Looking forward to the follow-up meeting. Michael, Dr. McGarry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Enjoy your
Thank you.
weekend.